When Brian and I were kidnapped in Lebanon, there was actually already a hostage crisis at the time. From the years 1982 to 1992, there were systematic kidnappings. So when we were kidnapped, it wasn't something that it wasn't just something that happened to just us. It actually happened to a number of people. And in the book, Brian mentions Lee Douglas and Philip Padfield, who also worked at the university that Brian worked at. And he meant in the footnotes on page 26, Brian mentions that they were killed by their captors. And the Lebanon hostage crisis obviously affects the story because the story is about the lives of people who were kidnapped during this particular time.
One of the most significant aspects of the story stems in the relationship between the captors and the hostages. Brian Keenan often describes the actions of the Lebanese captors as capricious and volatile. As readers, we understand that the captors' religious fundamentalism plays a large role in this seemingly unstable and erratic behavior. In fact, Keenan once states quite explicitly that the fanatics' minds are fed by what he calls superstitions, which strips reality away from these poor individuals and thus permits them to be aggressive and abusive to others. Because really, as mentioned by Keenan, their world is controlled by an authoritative denial, and their judgment are obscured by a blind obedience to extremist religious leaders.
When looking at the cultural aspects of the context that had an impact on Keenan's story, the British and Irish relation should be examined. Throughout the novel, Keenan emphasizes and takes great pride in his Irish background. In the beginning of the memoir, on page 29, the captors question, "You English?" At this point, Keenan sat up quite determined. "No, I am not English, I am Irish." The British-Irish relation is traced back to when all of Ireland was part of UK. As the United Kingdom defeated France during the Napoleonic Wars, Great Britain and Northern Ireland rapidly industrialized, therefore causing economic and social disparities between Ireland and Great Britain. After World War One, Irish nationalism rose, and a desire for self-identity resulted in a formation of the Free Irish State in 1922. Keenan's strong sense of self-identity and culture originates from the Irish history and its conflicts with Great Britain.
On page 36, when Brian remembers a time when he was asked where he was from, he says he answered with the same nonchalance, and perhaps this time filled with the native stubbornness of his city. And he says there was a touch of anger and aggression in his voice. So we get the idea that Brian has this sharp and angry attitude that he got from his city, and we can see this attitude when he describes other moments in the story, such as when he was beaten physically, and he calls Saeed a monster who thought he was a piece of rancid meat to be kicked and beaten on page 225, and he says the anger in him became a volcano in his chest. So we see this angry attitude in the way he writes, and if we go back, we can see that this is because of his city and his country and how the environment shaped him.
Brian Keenan's crass, powerful, and dominant Irish bravado allows him to survive and endure the captivity. Yet there are times when his Irishness falls short of a sort of delicacy. Keenan's authoritativeness is juxtaposed against John McCarthy's sensitivity and warmth. Of course, John McCarthy's background plays a central role in constructing his character. As a British bourgeoisie journalist, he values companionship and approaches relationships with a sincere care, love, and sympathy. This contrast is highly important in the hostages' survival, as the unique dynamics between the comrades helps them overcome difficulties. Keenan once wrote that he had to apologize to McCarthy for what McCarthy had to suffer for his Irishness and relentless resistance, to be forgiven for what he had done in seeking only to satisfy himself. McCarthy just smiled in return, comforting Keenan with a hand on his shoulder.
Keenan decides to go on a hunger strike during his incarceration in order to maintain authority in his life and show his discontent of the situation. Going on a hunger strike was one of the only ways of having a sense of command over oneself during captivity. On page 60, there is a quote: "I decided that I must again be forceful in my demands, that I must obtain some information as to why I was being held." With his overpowering Irish bravado, Keenan has a desire to have a sense of power over himself and also have his rights despite his helpless situation. Incarceration strips people of their freedom, but Keenan did not want his freedom to be taken away, which is why he participated in this hunger strike. Hunger strikes were prevalent throughout Irish history, and on page 60 there's a quote: "Hunger strike is a powerful weapon in the Irish psyche. It overcomes fear in its deepest sense. It removes and makes negligible the threat of punishment." An example of hunger strikes in Irish history is when the Irish Civil War ended in October 1923. Nearly 8,000 IRA prisoners participated in a hunger strike to protest against their detention by the Irish Free State. Keenan takes on this Irish tradition and puts it into play during his incarceration.
To me, the most interesting character and most memorable character was Abed, because from the perspective of someone who was actually a hostage, Abed was a very strange character because although he was a captor, uh, it seemed as if he was a hostage because essentially he was a hostage to his own faith. And on page 231, Brian remembers a time when Abed beat us, and we both ended up laughing because we knew that Abed was just trying to make himself a man. And he was really memorable because it was interesting watching someone who was actually a good person forcefully act violently. And we knew that Abed could be a good person, but to see him commit these actions that weren't genuine at all were very memorable.
I would have to say Frank Reed. The lack of direct dialogue and dynamic action by the character do not restrict his presence and influence on the larger picture. It is quite the opposite. He was a victim of extreme isolation, a living embodiment of the detrimental effects from deprivation of human contact and intellectual stimulation. He struggled to survive in the pitch black for months, and the humiliation by the captors tore him inside out. In fact, during a recent interview, Frank Reed mentioned that his hostage experience still remains as a heavy weight. Also, his actions to go against the non-negotiation policy is embedded within the idea that when you have been on the hook, you have a duty to the others. He is definitely a powerful character indeed.
Despite the brevity in which this character was mentioned, Mr. Paul created a strong but subtle impact on the readers. Mr. Paul is a retired man that lived on the first floor of the house that Keenan lived in. Keenan remembers Mr. Paul as someone who walked every day, but he became rapidly ill and suddenly died. The reason why Mr. Paul especially was memorable is because his death was one of the only incidents that Keenan recalled from his student years during his imprisonment. And it was also Keenan's first encounter with death. On page 10, there's a quote: "This attempt to remember became for me a mental exercise to overcome my own pathetic and frightened condition, reaching back to what I had originally written as a memorial to this old stranger and to my first confrontation with death." Keenan tries to think of incidents in the past in order to cope with his imprisonment, and Mr. Paul's sudden loss of power seems analogous to Keenan when he realized that his freedom was stripped from him during captivity.